Welcome to another Excel VBA tutorial. In today's video, we are actually going to cover a pretty advanced topic when you think about it. In today's video, we are going to import a text file using Power Query, but we're going to automate this whole Power Query process and importing it into the worksheet all using VBA. So there's going to be a lot of different components to it, but I'm going to walk you through the different components and we're just going to build it one section at a time. Couple key things I do want to throw out there before I actually start the video. I'm not going to actually go into Power Query in too much detail. Power Query is its own little beast. I mean, it uses its own language and there's a whole different set of functionalities that you can leverage in Power Query. And so I could dedicate, probably hundreds of videos just to cover Power Query. So I'm not going to focus in too much detail on it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to take a text file and we're just going to import it, and then we're going to go get the information from Power Query and then basically put it into the VBA module itself. So not too in-depth, but enough to just show you, hey, this is where you would need to go within Power Query to get the information to put into VBA. Now with that being said, we're going to get started. So as you can tell, I currently have an Excel workbook open, and the goal is to take this little text file right here of all this different information and import it into my Excel workbook. And so normally if we do this, there's a really simple way we can do it. If we go over here to the Data tab, and then if we go over here to the left side of it and we say from text CSV, what it will do is a new window will pop up and we can go and specify the file that we want to import. And so this works with either text files or CSV files. Now my file is located on my desktop and it's called sales data. And so once I click that, it's going to establish a connection, and then we're going to have to fill out some stuff before we can actually import it. One of the things we have to fill out is we have to specify the coding of the actual file itself. In this case, it's just a standard Unicode. So normally what Power Query brings up is usually right. Very rarely have I had a situation where what Power Query is recommending is actually wrong. So you can almost always stay with the default setting. And then in this example, the delimiters are tab based. So it's like we're pressing tab on the keyboard, and that's how each column is separated. And so the delimiter is fine. Again, Power Query will usually go through it itself and try to determine what the delimiter is. And then another parameter that we can set is the data type detection. And so what this will do is it will go through each one of the columns and try to guess basically the data type that's in that column. And so in this example, it's just using the first 200 rows. And really, why does it do that? Well, it doesn't want to spend a bunch of time going through in some cases a 100,000 row data set to figure out the data type. Usually if you look at the first 200 rows, it gives you a pretty good idea of what that data type is. So I usually just let it put it to the default setting. And then once I've done that, you can press load and it will actually load the data. So usually it creates a new sheet, and then you'll see this new little pane come up that has the actual query itself and the data connection. And so this is all the information related to Power Query. Now what I want to do is I want to go into Power Query and get really the code behind it. So the information where it's going in there, getting the contents, and then transforming that data. And so how do I do that? Well, I right click and then I go to Edit. And then I'm now in the Power Query experience. So this is a new window, and I actually have to close this window if I want to go back into Excel and actually click anything. But what I want to do is, now that I'm in here, I want to go to the View section of the ribbon. And then I'm going to go over here to Advanced Editor. And so what's going to pop up is a new window, and this is the formula itself that is used by Power Query to get the information and transform the information. And my goal is to take this formula and then put it into VBA. Now, I already have it in VBA, so I'm not going to recopy it, but what you can do is you can always just copy this formula and then take it and put it in there. And then this is really your query in a sense. It's just a couple transformations and then pulling in the source data. So now that we know how to get the formula itself, let's now jump into the VBA editor and actually build our script. And so I'm going to close out this, and in order for my VBA script to work, I have to actually delete the table itself and then the query itself. You can't have two queries that have the same name. It will return an error. And just to be clean, I'm going to delete that sheet because I don't really need it. I just want this one that's called query table. Okay, so I'm going to go in my developer tab over to Visual Basic. And then now I can actually go in here and create my subroutine. And so I'm going to create a new subroutine called import text file. And I'll put a PQ for Power Query because I'm actually going to create another video where we don't use Power Query. So this is just how we're going to differentiate it. And once I've done that, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare my variables. And the first couple ones are going to be all strings. So it's going to be query name. And as you guessed, this is the name of our query and it's a string. The source formula is what we saw in Power Query, so the actual formula itself. When we put it into VBA, we want it to be a string. So we're going to declare it as a string. And then I need something called a connection string. And then I'll explain what this is later in the code because it makes a little bit more sense when we have some context. And now that I've declared my variables, the next thing I want to do is create a new query and define the query formula. And so this is all going to be straightforward. So the first one, query name is equal to, we'll call it something, useful, sales data pool. And then the source formula is the query itself. Now, I already have this in VBA, so I'm just going to go and copy it. But this is the exact same thing that we were seeing in Power Query. So I'm going to copy it. And then I'm going to paste it. And I want to uncomment the code. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to expand this. Okay. So let's walk through this query. Again, not going to go into too much detail, but we'll just explain kind of what we're looking at. So every Power Query query starts off with the same keyword, it's let, and then we have to define each step in our query. Well, the first step in our query is always the source step, and basically what is that? That's saying, well, where am I getting my data from? So I'm going to define a step called source, and I'm going to set that step equal to, now this is where it gets a little bit confusing because it says csv.document. Well, if you remember when we actually clicked on importing the data, it said CSV or text file. They both use the same kind of function within Power Query, and so they both use the CSV function. And what we want to do is we want to use the document component of it, and we want to define the information that we want to store in this document. And so we have to pass through a couple parameters. Well, one of them is the actual data itself, and we have to specify the file it's coming from. So we use the file object, and then we define the contents of that file, and then we pass through the path of where that file exists. And so that's our first parameter. We want to specify how we want to delimit our file. And so in this case, I'm saying, hey, I want to use the tab delimiter. I want to specify the number of columns I want to pull in. Well, there were 5 columns in my data set, so I'm going to pull in 5 columns. And then I want to specify the encoding. And so that was what I was saying before, the one that, how is our actual data encoded in this file? Now this is the one that Power Query did by default for us, so it chose 1200. We just leave it like that. And then the last one, I'm not really sure what this one does, but again, it's auto-generated, so I kind of just let it and leave it be. But those are all the parameters that go into this section, and this is, again, it's just defining our source, or our data source, pulling it in, and then transforming it a little bit. And so now that we have a data source, we can transform this data. And so what we do is we create another step, and we're going to call this step promoted headers. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a table of our data now, and we're going to promote the headers of that table. And so, well, what's actually in this table? Well, it's actually the source file that we defined up here. So this is the data itself. It's the source step. And then what we're going to do to that source data is we're going to promote the headers so that way they're to the top. Now, if we didn't put this as true, then what would happen is there's basically just auto-generated headers. But my data had headers, so I want to promote that first row to a header. Now, as you can tell, I'm just taking the first step and putting it into the second step. Well, when I look at the third step, I'm just taking the second step and putting it into the third step. So as you can see, it kind of builds on each other. One step goes to the next step, and then the next step, and then the next step. Well, in this third step, we're just changing the type of data in our particular column. So we're taking our table object, and then we're transforming the column types. And so we're going through and saying, well, this is our data. And then we're going to go through each column and define what data type is in that column. So the first column, FY, has a data type of int64 type. Second column, int64 type, int64 type. And then our fourth column has a number type. And then our fifth column has a text data type. So you can change this yourself if you so choose. You just have to make sure it's syntactically correct. So whatever Power Query specifies. And if you want more information on that, Power Query uses the M language. So that's what's used in the background. And you can think of that as just the VBA behind Power Query. So if you know M, you can create your own customizable queries. And so these are all the steps that we've defined in this query. We've got our data, and then we transform our data multiple times. And then what I need to do next is say, okay, now that I have each step, which step do you want to actually put into the workbook? So I call my in keyword, and then I specify the step that I want to put into my workbook. Well, I want to just take my last step because now I've done all my transformation. So I'm going to use my last step as the data that I want to put into my workbook. But technically, there's nothing stopping you from using the second step or the first step. You just have to keep in mind that if you use the first step, that's going to be just the raw data without any transformation. If you use the second step, it says it's the raw data, but just the header is attached to it. And so it won't have any data types associated to each column. So that's all you have to keep in mind about when you choose what step you want to actually go into the workbook. Now, again, I kept it pretty brief. There's still a lot more to this than what you're seeing. But at least when you're looking at this query, it's not looking completely foreign. You're actually seeing something. And so that's kind of going back to the purpose of this video. I'm kind of already assuming that you have a query built and you just want to take that query and integrate it into VBA somehow. Well, this is how we integrate that formula into VBA. And so now that I've defined my query and my source formula, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a new query to my workbook. And that new query is just going to be the new query that I defined up above. So I'm going to add a new query to my workbook. And so I'm going to use my active workbook as the location of where I want to put this query. And I'm going to go into the queries property of that workbook. And what I can do is I call the add method to add a new query. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to define the name of this query. And so I already have the name defined up above. It's just query name. And then from here, I'm going to pass through a comma and then an underscore because I'm going to do multiple lines. And then I need to put in one more required parameter, and that's the formula. Well, as you guess, the formula is just the source formula that I defined up above, and that's really the Power Query formula. And so I'm going to define that as the source formula. And then I'm going to put another comma and then an underscore. And then if we so choose, we can put in an optional parameter. And this one is the description. And this is just something where if somebody looks at this query, they get some kind of context as to what exactly is it doing. So I like to put it in here because, sometimes when you're looking back at something, it's nice to have some context as to what it's actually doing. So I'm going to say this pulls in my sales data from the text file. So again, it doesn't have to be super long, but enough to give me some context. So now that I've created a new query in my actual workbook, there's one more thing that I have to do before I can actually create a table and then pull this data into that table. And the next thing that I have to do is create a connection string. Why do I have to create this connection string? Well, just because I create a table in my Excel workbook doesn't mean that any information is actually going to be in it. And so what I have to do is create a connection between my query and that table, so that way I can pull the information in from that query into my table. But I need some kind of way to tell the table where to look for this information. Well, that connection string is going to tell the table where to look for this information, but I've got to create the connection string. So I'm going to say create connection string. And then I'm going to take that connection string variable I declared up above. I'm going to walk through this line by line, but don't be confused if you look at it and you're going like, what's going on here? Just take it one step at a time. Sometimes when people see this for the first time, they're kind of going like, whoa, this is kind of all foreign. Don't worry. So with a connection string, we got to define what type of connection string is it. Well, in our particular example, we're using an OLEDB connection string. And the reason why we're using that one is because it's kind of a built-in one in Excel that allows us to connect with different, APIs and stuff like that. And this one is just, all it's saying is that it's an object-linked and embedded database. And so it's a database that we're going to go and connect to. And so this is just defining what type of database it is. And so I'm going to pass through the first parameter. And then from here, I'm going to do multiple lines. So I'm going to do an ampersand and a space. The next one is the provider. And this one is basically saying what is kind of like the driver in a sense. And for Power Query, it's usually using an API. And so this API is basically how we interface with this particular tool called Power Query. And the name of this API is Microsoft.mashup. Mashup is the API for Power Query. And then from there, it's the OLDB.1. And then it is the semicolon again. So this is basically saying, hey, this is for Power Query. That's the API for Power Query. And then I'm going to create another line. The next one is going to be the data source. So where does this data live within, everything? So within context, where does it live? Well, it lives within my workbook because my query lives within my workbook. And so I'm going to put a $sign and then workbook. And so it's saying it's within the workbook. And then again, I'm going to put another line. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, where is the location of this data? So I know it's within the workbook, but where exactly is this query that I'm looking for? Well, the query is just simply named sales data pull. And so that's the location of our query, or really where our data lives. And again, I want to make sure that everything's spelled correctly. There's no spaces, and it looks exactly as what we're showing here, because if you leave an extra space, if you, you put an extra comma or something like that, it will return an error. So you got to make sure it is correct, because unfortunately, they don't give you any leeway. And then the last one is called extended properties. I'm not sure exactly what this does, so but it's auto-generated, so I keep it in there because the last thing I want to do is break it. And so that is 5 quotation marks, so 4 and then a 5th one. And so this is our connection string. So this is how we're going to take our table and connect it to the query that we just created. So now that I have my connection string, I can actually create my my list object in my actual workbook. So I'm going to add a table to my worksheet and pull the query in. So keeping it simple. So I'm going to say with active sheet dot list objects. So all the list objects on a particular workbook, they live, within a particular worksheet, live within the list objects collection. And I'm just going to call the add method. And there's parameters that I can pass through. The first parameter that I need to pass through is the source type. So where is this data coming from? Well, it's an external source. So I put XLSRC, external, and then, again, I'm going to do multiple lines. Yes, I know, there should be a space. It's very picky if you start adding extra spaces when you're not supposed to. This is going to be a linked source, so I want to make sure it's linked, so that way if I go and refresh it, it will actually refresh. So I'm going to set that parameter to equal to true. The next one is, does my data have headers? And so in this case it does, so I do specify that. And so you want to make sure you spell it correctly. It's Excel list object has headers, and then it's Excel yes. And so that's just saying, yes, my data does have headers, please put those headers into the list object, please. The next one is the source of that data. So where is the source of my data? Well, we defined it up with the connection string. So I'm going to say, well, it's just the connection string. So you need to go and use this connection string to actually go and get the data. That's all. And then there's another parameter that we can define. Now, it doesn't really work. I don't know why it doesn't work with this particular table, but I mean, it's good to know that it does exist. And really, it's just defining the style of our table. So we can actually say it doesn't have to be the default green one, but for whatever reason, it's not working on mine. So when I get an answer as to why that is, I will put that in the description, but I haven't been able to find an answer yet. And so this is just defining what the style of my table looks like. So I'm saying table style medium 8, which I think is like black and gray, something like that. And so from here, there's one more parameter that we have to pass through, and that's the destination. So where do you want this table to live within the worksheet? And so we just have to pass through a range object. And so what we're going to say is range. What is it? Brackets and then quotation marks A1. And then from here, I'm going to close everything off. And then there's one more thing that I have to define about my list object. So it's not a true list object, it's a list object, but it's actually got a connection to a query. And so I have to define it as a query table because it's this connection link where this list object is linked with this query. And so this query table defines that connection. And so I made another video to kind of say why this is important, because we can now get information about my list object. So I can get things about the connection string, I can get information about the actual workbook connection. If we export the connection, where does that connection file live within our system? So when we define it like this, we now get some extra benefit that we can leverage later on in our code if we so choose about the information regarding our particular query table. So that's why we add that. And so now that we've done that, we have a couple more things that we need to define about it. The first one is the command type. So this is saying how we're going to pull our data. And so this one is called Excel command SQL. Why do we define it like that? Well, technically an OLE database is a SQL Server database, and so SQL servers use SQL. And so we're saying that when we want to pull this data, we're going to have to use SQL to pull this data. And so that's how we're defining it here. We're saying, hey, when we pull this data, we're going to use SQL. And then we're going to define the query to pull the information from that table. And so it's called the command text property. And what we're going to do is pass through an array. And then we're going to put the actual query itself. And we're going to say select. I mean, technically you can put lowercase, but I like to keep it consistent. Select all columns from sales data pull. And then close the brackets, close the quotation marks, and this is our query that will pull the information from this OLE database. This is the name of the table, and this is us pulling all the columns from that table. And then from here, we want to refresh it after we actually pull the data so that way we can see it. And then we're going to put background query equal to false. And what this will do is it will refresh it, but it won't have the query keep running every couple minutes. So this will have it run once, and then if we want to refresh it, we actually have to click the refresh button. And then I'm going to end my with block. So I'm going to try running this. Hopefully it works the first time. Sometimes something happens with the connection string. Like I said, it's very sensitive. It will give you errors if you have extra spaces with parameters that you're not supposed to. So ideally it should work. So let's give it a try and see what happens. Oh, thank goodness it worked. Whew. You don't know how stressful that was. Okay, so yeah, it created a new query in our workbook. And if we want to see that query, we just go to the Data tab, the Queries in Connection, and then you can see our query here. So it created a new query. Here's the name of it. You know, you can always get properties about it if you so choose. So this is the definition. So this is the actual query string that we created. Here's the command type. Here's our query itself. And then here's our description. Here's the name of our query. Here's the location of our query, the name, and the sheet that exists on. So just different information that if we want to leverage later on, it's now a lot more easier because we've defined it as a query table. So that actually does it for today's video. If you have any questions about, you know, how we imported this information into Excel using VBA, you know, please put it down in the comments below. I get it. This is kind of an advanced topic and it can be a little confusing at first, but you know, I always tell people just break it into chunks, you know, first do the Power Query section, then create the connection string, and then just create the table. And then from there, if you want to do any modifications, at least you got the basic structure there. So that's the important part. Also, if you can make sure to like the video, that helps out a bunch because then other people can find it easier. And if you're not already, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. So thank you again for watching, guys, and we'll see you in the next video where we're going to create the same query, but we're going to skip over Power Query and we're just going to use another built-in method using VBA. So thanks again, guys.